ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be the next video on the cell membrane, and specifically understanding what the cell membrane is and the fluid mosaic model. Let's get started on this next video. So when we think about the cell membrane, we have to think about what the cell membrane does and what it is. Well, it's that phospholipid bilayer with a couple of other things that are put on there, but those other things are going to go through and help regulate homeostasis. So we're looking at the exterior of the cell, and we're thinking about those phospholipids with the other molecules in that fluid mosaic model to understand what its purpose is. Alright, so we're going to break this video down into 3 parts, that way we can understand what the fluid mosaic model is. The first part is going to be review the phospholipids' function and their purpose in the cell membrane. The second component of this is we're going to understand each individual part of the cell membrane. And then lastly, we're going to go through and tie it all together to see how it enables the cell to maintain homeostasis. So remember, a phospholipid, that is going to be a lipid containing a phosphate group in its molecule. It's going to consist of 2 parts. It has a hydrophilic head that likes the water, and we have hydrophilic tails, those dislike the water. If we look here to the left, we can break that phospholipid down into a couple of parts. We have the phosphate group, we have our glycerol, and then we have our fatty acid tails. And each of these 3 groups is going to change the polarity to make that hydrophilic and hydrophobic region along that phospholipid. Now, if we're to go through and look at each individual phospholipid along that cell membrane, the hydrophilic heads are going to be along these regions, the top and the bottom, and then the tails are going to be placed in the center. And that's going to enable certain molecules to go through and be given passage through that phospholipid bilayer, and some molecules are not. Now, if we zoom into the cell membrane more, we need to understand the cell membrane helps organisms maintain homeostasis by controlling what substances enter or leave. Remember, homeostasis is the ability to maintain a constant internal environment in response to environmental changes. So why are these regions inside and outside of the cell important? Well, the hydrophilic heads are going to be polar, the hydrophobic tails are not. So the polarity of the molecules is going to go through, and it's going to affect its passage through the cell membrane. Large molecules that are generally nonpolar will not be able to go through and pass through, whereas small molecules that are semipolar will be able to. So homeostasis is again maintained by this cell membrane and the hydrophilic and hydrophobic regions of those phospholipids. Now, the fancy way of going through and talking about the cell membrane is the fluid mosaic model, and it's going to consist of a couple parts. We call it fluid because the phospholipids can move fluidly like a liquid independently of each other. The first part in the phospholipid bilayer is going to be proteins, or the fluid mosaic model. Obviously, this is made out of phospholipids. That's the majority of the cell membrane. We are going to have glycoproteins, and then the last component here are going to be cholesterol. All 4 of these are going to go through and affect how the cell membrane interacts with the exterior and interior environments within the cell. Alright, so the goal here is for us to go through each of these different pieces and understand them in a little detail. Alright, so the first and most important piece here are proteins. We're going to see another video on proteins that's going to help us understand them in more detail. Proteins are going to go through and provide a couple of different things, but they're going to act as a gate that is going to enable the passage of material into the cell, or they can go through and facilitate cellular communication. So if we think about what their purpose is again to go through and enable large nonpolar or large molecules that wouldn't normally pass through the membrane to pass through, so that way the cell can go through and regulate that. So again, they're acting as a gate to enable that passage of material. Now, one key important concept here when we go through and talk about small molecules. Small molecules like water can pass through the cell membrane without these proteins. Because they're so small, they can fit in between the gaps of the phospholipids, and because of their polarity, they can go through and move without the use of that protein. Again, we're going to look at another video that's going to talk about aquaporins, and it's going to talk about osmosis and water exchange, but just for now, understand that small molecules like water can pass through the cell membrane. Now, the next molecule we're going to go through and look at is a glycoprotein. Glycoproteins are going to be a molecule that consists of carbohydrates and a protein, and they enable cellular recognition and communication. So cells need to go through and communicate, and what these cells are going to do is they're going to move along and they're going to recognize different cells based on these glycoproteins. They're basically flags, and the molecular shape of those flags is going to go through and tell other cells what type of cell this is and how to go through and communicate with it. So glycoproteins are molecules that consist of a carbohydrate and a protein, and they are there to recognize and allow for cellular communication. Now, the last component here that we're going to look at is cholesterol. Cholesterol is a molecule that maintains cellular integrity, allows the membrane to stick together when the temperature fluctuates. And these are these little hexagon, almost puzzle pieces in between the phospholipid membrane. What they're going to do is they're going to make sure that the cell membrane maintains its fluidity when the temperature changes. So the same way that proteins can go through and denature when the temperature gets too hot, we can also see when the extreme temperature changes, either when it's too cold or too hot, we can see that the membrane is going to go through and break down, and it's not going to retain its fluidity. The purpose of cholesterol is to resist those changes in temperature and make sure that when it is too cold or when it is too hot, the cell membrane stays together and it is held together in one fluid piece. Alright, so let's go through and review the different pieces here and understand what we're supposed to be looking at. What we looked at today was the fluid mosaic model. What the fluid mosaic model is a mold representing the fluid nature of the cell membrane. It enables homeostasis in the cell and regulates what enters in and out of the cell. And then we learned about the parts of this cell membrane. We learned about phospholipids. We learned about proteins. So phospholipids are those lipids that are making up the majority of that membrane. Proteins are going to go through and enable for cellular communication and enable for things to pass through. Glycoproteins are primary purpose is only for cellular communication. And then lastly, we learned about cholesterol, which maintains the fluidity and integrity of that cell when the temperatures go through and fluctuate. All right, so this is going to be the end of the video. Did you learn? Well, did you learn a couple of things here? Did you learn about the parts of the cell membrane? Did you learn about each of the individual functions and the parts of that membrane? And then lastly, did you learn how to go through and understand how all of these parts are tied together to ensure that homeostasis is maintained within the cell? This is going to be the end of the video, and we'll see you all in class tomorrow.